At his father's funeral, billionaire Alexander Sinclair did the unthinkable. In front of the world, he knelt before a poor florist, Emily Carter, and proposed. Her response? It shook the world. A love story filled with betrayal, passion, and redemption, where money means nothing, but love means everything. The sky wept with heavy clouds as the rain drizzled softly over the grand estate of the Sinclair family. The towering iron gates stood open, allowing a fleet of black limousines to glide through the long driveway, each carrying influential figures, business tycoons, and media personnel hungry for a story. This was no ordinary funeral. It was the final farewell to Victor Sinclair, a billionaire magnate whose name alone had shaken industries and built an empire worth billions. The world had come to watch, to mourn, and to speculate about what would happen next. At the heart of it all stood Alexander Sinclair. His broad shoulders were stiff beneath his tailored black suit. He was the only son of the departed tycoon, a man expected to take the throne his father left behind. But Alexander wasn't thinking about the empire right now. He wasn't thinking about the wealth, the inheritance, or the power the world assumed he would inherit effortlessly. He was thinking about regret. The regret of never having a proper goodbye with his father. The regret of unresolved words left unsaid. The regret of her. While the elite and privileged stood together, whispering their empty condolences, a lone figure stood at the farthest edge of the crowd, unnoticed, unacknowledged, and yet more heartbroken than anyone present. Her name was Emily Carter. Her trembling fingers clutched the small black umbrella she held over her head, shielding herself from the rain. Unlike the other women draped in designer coats and heels, she wore a simple black dress, one she had worn too many times to occasions far less grand than this. Her heart ached as she stared at the mahogany coffin resting on the podium, surrounded by expensive white lilies. The same man who had once played a role in her family's downfall was now gone forever. Her mother had worked as a maid in the Sinclair mansion for 15 years, serving with loyalty, only to be dismissed over a false accusation. The pain of being thrown out, of losing everything overnight, had shaped Emily's entire life. And yet, despite the bitterness of the past, she had come. Not for Victor Sinclair. She had come because of him. Alexander. Emily's gaze lingered on the man standing by the coffin, his face unreadable, his eyes hollow. Once upon a time, he had been her everything. She had met Alexander as a child, running barefoot through the gardens of the Sinclair estate while her mother worked tirelessly inside. Back then, he had been just a boy with a mischievous grin, one who had no idea what wealth truly meant. They had shared laughter, stolen moments, whispered dreams beneath the stars. But as they grew older, everything changed. The weight of his last name, the expectations, the divide between their worlds. It became too much. Then, when her mother was wrongly accused of stealing and they were thrown out of the estate, Emily had waited. She had hoped. She had believed that Alexander would come for her, that he would stand up for the truth. But he never did. And that silence had shattered whatever fragile bond remained between them. Now, after years of separation, here they were again. He stood among the rich, mourning his father. She stood among the forgotten, mourning the boy he used to be. The priest's solemn voice echoed through the air as he spoke about Victor's legacy. Alexander remained silent, staring at the casket, his emotions locked behind a mask of cold control. But then, he turned, and his gaze landed on her. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face. His steel blue eyes, once so distant, now burned with something Emily couldn't decipher. The murmurs around them faded. The rain became nothing more than a soft hum. For the first time in years, they saw each other. A storm of emotions clashed in his chest. Shock, regret, longing. Without a second thought, he moved. Gasps rippled through the mourners as Alexander Sinclair, the billionaire heir, The man who never showed vulnerability walked past his grieving family, past his business partners, past the cameras and reporters, straight toward Emily. The world watched in stunned silence as he reached her. Emily's breath caught in her throat as he stepped so close that she could smell the faint trace of his cologne mixed with the rain. She should have walked away, but her feet remained frozen. Then, in a moment that would make headlines around the world, Alexander did the unthinkable. He dropped to one knee. Emily's heart nearly stopped. Gasps filled the air. Reporters fumbled with their cameras. His own family looked on in horror. And then, in a voice that was raw with emotion, he asked the question that no one could have ever predicted. "Emily Carter, will you marry me?" The words hit her like a hurricane, sweeping away everything she thought she knew. Tears burned at the edges of her vision. Her hands trembled at her sides. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not now. Not after everything. The world held its breath, and as her heart pounded against her ribs, Emily whispered the only response that made sense. "This isn't right, Alexander." Then she turned away, leaving him, and the world, stunned. A billionaire, kneeling before a woman the world barely knew. A proposal at his father's funeral. The disbelief was deafening. The weight of the moment pressed down on Emily like an invisible force, making it hard to breathe. Every eye was locked on her, some filled with shock, some with judgment, and some with cold amusement. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the murmurs around her. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Alexander Sinclair, the man who once meant everything to her, the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most, was suddenly asking for her hand in marriage. And not in the quiet privacy of a heartfelt moment, but in front of the entire world at his father's funeral. "This isn't right, Alexander." Her own voice sounded foreign to her ears, shaky yet firm. His piercing blue eyes remained locked onto hers, unreadable, desperate. She could see something flickering beneath his cold facade, a silent plea, a sorrow she had never seen in him before. But Emily wouldn't let herself believe it. She couldn't. With her breath caught in her throat, she turned away. And in doing so, she did what no one in the world had ever dared to do. She walked away from a Sinclair. As soon as Emily disappeared into the distance, chaos erupted. The media wasted no time. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered into microphones, and headlines formed within seconds. Billionaire heir proposes to mystery woman at father's funeral. Gets rejected. Who is Emily Carter? The poor florist who stole Alexander Sinclair's heart. Scandal or true love? A proposal no one saw coming. Alexander still knelt on the wet grass, his fists clenching at his sides. He had known it was a risk. He had known Emily wouldn't say yes immediately, but he hadn't expected the pain to cut so deep. His mother, Margaret Sinclair, stormed toward him, her face twisted in rage. "What in God's name are you doing?" she hissed through gritted teeth, her elegant gloved hands grabbing his arm and forcing him to stand. "You just humiliated yourself, humiliated us at your father's funeral." Alexander barely heard her. His gaze remained fixed on the spot where Emily had stood just moments ago. She had been here, so close, close enough to touch. And then, just like before, he lost her again. His mother's voice snapped him back to reality. "That woman! Who is she? Why would you do something so reckless?" Alexander took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders back as his mask of control slipped back into place. "She's the woman I should have never let go." Then, without another word, he turned away, stepping into his sleek black Rolls-Royce. He had made his move. Now he had to make sure he never lost Emily again. Emily didn't stop walking until she reached the bus stop, far away from the Sinclair estate. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her small handbag, searching for her phone. A flood of messages. Missed calls. Her past had just collided with her present. and the world was watching. "Emily, I just saw the news. What is happening?" A frantic voice message from her best friend, Lena. "Who is he? Why did he propose? Are you secretly a billionaire?" Another message, this time from one of her co-workers at the flower shop. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't have answers. All she had were memories. Memories of a boy who had once promised her the world, memories of pain, when that same boy turned into a man who never looked back. She could still hear the echoes of her mother's voice the day they had been thrown out of the Sinclair mansion. "People like them don't care about people like us, Emily. Never forget that." And yet, he had proposed to her today. Why? Why now? Her fingers curled into a fist as she took a deep breath. She would not be a spectacle for the media. She would not be the poor girl who fell for a billionaire's whims. She had fought too hard, built too much on her own, to be pulled back into the world that had once discarded her. Emily Carter was no longer that helpless little girl waiting for a Sinclair to save her. And she would make sure Alexander Sinclair knew that. Back at his penthouse, Alexander sat in silence, a drink untouched in his hands. The city skyline stretched endlessly before him. But his mind was elsewhere, on her, Emily Carter, the girl who had once been his best friend, his first love, his greatest regret. He had thought burying himself in work, in money and power would erase her from his thoughts. It never had. "Sir, there are reporters outside. They want a statement about the proposal." His assistant Daniel entered cautiously. Alexander exhaled sharply, setting his glass down. "Let them talk." His voice was cold, decisive. "Let them speculate." "And what about Ms. Carter?" Daniel hesitated. "The media is already digging into her past. They'll expose everything about her." Alexander's jaw clenched. "No one touches her." His voice was steel. "I don't care how much it costs. No one harms Emily." Daniel nodded and left. Alone once more, Alexander stared down at the city, his mind replaying the moment she had walked away. Emily Carter was not someone he could let go of again. Not this time. Not ever. And if she thought she could escape him so easily, she was wrong. The world had only one topic to discuss: Alexander Sinclair's shocking proposal to a mystery woman. Breaking news. Billionaire proposes to an unknown woman at his father's funeral. Who is Emily Carter? The florist who rejected Alexander Sinclair in front of the world. Scandal or true love? The engagement that left everyone stunned. Television screens flashed with endless discussions. Paparazzi camped outside the Sinclair estate, desperate for a glimpse of the billionaire. Social media exploded with theories. But amidst the chaos, one person wanted nothing more than to disappear: Emily Carter. Sitting in her tiny apartment, Emily gripped a steaming cup of coffee, staring at the news coverage on her phone. Her name was everywhere. Her past, her job, her entire life, exposed for the world to see. Comment sections were flooded with mixed reactions. She must be a gold digger. Why else would a billionaire propose to her? No, did you see how she rejected him? She's different. Maybe he truly loves her. She probably has some dirt on him. Why else would a man like Alexander propose to someone like her? Emily exhaled sharply and shut off the screen. This was exactly why she had walked away. Her life wasn't a game. She wasn't some Cinderella waiting to be rescued by a billionaire. A sudden loud knock on her door made her jump. She hesitated. No one ever came to her apartment unannounced. Another knock, louder this time. Heart pounding, she stepped forward and cautiously opened the door. And there he was, Alexander Sinclair. Standing in the dim hallway, his presence was overpowering. Dressed in a black coat, his broad shoulders framed by the soft golden glow of the apartment lights, he looked like a man who had come to rewrite destiny. Emily's breath hitched. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "And yet, here I am," Alexander murmured, stepping inside before she could stop him. "Alexander, you need to leave," Emily said, crossing her arms. "We need to talk." His voice was firm. She let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, now you want to talk? After humiliating me in front of the world?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "I didn't humiliate you, Emily. I asked you to marry me." "At your father's funeral," she snapped. "Do you have any idea what you've done to my life? The media is outside my workplace. My phone won't stop ringing. I lost 2 clients at the flower shop because they think I'm some scandalous gold digger." Alexander sighed, running a hand through his thick hair. "I didn't mean for any of that to happen. I just couldn't lose you again." Emily stared at him, her chest tightening. "You lost me a long time ago, Alexander." Silence stretched between them, thick with unresolved pain. Then, in a low, raw voice, Alexander asked the question that had haunted him for years. "Do you hate me, Emily?" Emily swallowed hard. Did she? She wanted to. God, she wanted to. But hate wasn't what she felt when she looked at him. It was pain, longing, a love that had never truly died. And that terrified her more than anything. Alexander exhaled heavily and sat down on her worn-out couch. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "You never gave me a chance to explain what happened, Emily." She scoffed. "Explain? What is there to explain? My mother and I were thrown out of your mansion, humiliated and left to struggle for survival. And you—" her voice cracked. "You never even came for me." Alexander flinched. "Do you really think I wanted that to happen?" His voice was quiet, almost broken. Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" He rubbed a hand over his face. "I didn't know what my father had done until it was too late." Emily shook her head. No, that's not possible. You were his son. You had power. You could have helped us." "I was just a boy, Emily." His voice rose, eyes blazing with frustration. "I begged my father to take back his accusations against your mother, but he refused. He said that people like her didn't belong in our world." Emily's heart twisted. "And you listened to him," she whispered. "I fought him," Alexander corrected. "I told him I loved you." Emily gasped softly. "He threatened to ruin your life even more if I didn't let you go." His voice cracked. "I had no choice, Emily. I thought staying away would protect you." Tears burned in her eyes, years of anger, resentment, and unanswered questions, now suddenly unraveling before her. "Then why now?" she asked shakily. "Why propose to me after all these years?" Alexander stood up and closed the distance between them. "Because I can't let you go again," he murmured. Their eyes locked, a silent battle between past wounds and present emotions, and for the first time in years, Emily saw the boy she had once loved, buried beneath the powerful billionaire. But was it too late? Emily turned away, hugging herself. "This changes nothing, Alexander. We're still from different worlds." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. "Then let me prove to you that I don't care about that anymore." She turned to face him, eyes wary. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" A slow smirk played on his lips. "Give me 1 month." Emily blinked. "What?" 1 month, Alexander repeated. "Give me 1 month to show you that I'm not the same man you walked away from." Emily hesitated. Every instinct told her to say no. But deep down, a part of her wanted to see if he meant it. "Fine," she whispered. 1 month. But if you break my heart again, Alexander, I swear I will never forgive you." Alexander stepped closer, tilting her chin up with his finger. "I won't break your heart, Emily." His voice was a promise. "I'm going to win it back." And as much as she wanted to resist, her heart had already begun to betray her. Emily Carter had spent years building walls around her heart, walls strong enough to keep Alexander Sinclair out. But now, standing in her tiny apartment, staring into his piercing blue eyes, she realized she had just made a dangerous deal. 1 month. That was the bargain. Give me 1 month to prove to you that I'm not the same man you walked away from." The words echoed in her mind, taunting her, tempting her, and despite every instinct screaming at her to say no, she had agreed. Now she wasn't sure if she had made a mistake or the biggest decision of her life. Emily wasn't going to make this easy for him. If Alexander wanted to prove himself, he had to do it without his billions, without his power, and without his name opening every door for him. No private jets, no bodyguards, no luxury hotels, she had warned him. If you want to be in my life, you live in my world. And to her utter shock, he agreed. That was how Alexander Sinclair, one of the wealthiest men in the world, ended up standing in front of a rundown apartment with nothing but a single duffel bag in his hand. Emily crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. "Are you sure about this?" Alexander smirked. "What? Afraid I won't survive?" "No," she shot back smoothly. "I'm afraid you'll run back to your penthouse the first time you have to take public transportation." He chuckled, stepping closer. "Oh, Emily, you have no idea how far I'm willing to go for you." Her heart betrayed her. It skipped a beat. She turned away quickly, determined not to let his words get to her. Not yet. Emily had one goal, to show Alexander that their worlds were too different, so she made sure his first day in her life was as normal as possible. He had to wake up to the noise of a bustling street instead of the silence of a penthouse. He had to make his own breakfast, which resulted in burnt toast and a blaring fire alarm. He had to take the subway, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers instead of being chauffeured in a Rolls-Royce. By the time they arrived at Emily's small flower shop, he already looked exhausted. Emily couldn't help but smirk. "Tired already, Mr. Billionaire?" Alexander leaned against the counter, loosening the top button of his shirt. "Is it bad that I miss my driver?" Emily laughed. A real, genuine laugh. It had been years since he had made her laugh like that, and he noticed. His gaze softened. "I missed that sound," he said quietly. Her breath hitched, and for a moment something shifted between them. But before she could respond, the shop bell rang, snapping her back to reality. She turned away quickly, reminding herself that this wasn't real. Alexander was just trying to prove a point, and she wouldn't let herself fall for him again. From that night, Emily sat on her small balcony staring at the city lights. She didn't hear him approach until he spoke. "I never stopped thinking about you, you know." She turned, startled. Alexander stood beside her, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. She swallowed hard. "You don't have to say things like that, Alexander." "But it's the truth." She looked away, focusing on the stars instead. She couldn't afford to believe him. "Then why didn't you come back?" she whispered. Alexander sighed, sitting down beside her. "Because I was a coward," he admitted. "I told myself that you deserved a better life, but the truth is, I was afraid you wouldn't forgive me." Emily closed her eyes. "You're right. I didn't forgive you." Silence. Then, his voice, low, almost broken. "Do you think you ever could?" She didn't answer, because deep down she wasn't sure anymore. Over the next few days, something unexpected happened. Alexander learned how to brew coffee in a tiny kitchen. He started helping out at her flower shop, shocking customers who recognized him. He even figured out how to navigate the subway without looking completely lost. And Emily. She started seeing the man behind the billionaire. One night, after closing the flower shop, it started to rain. Hard. They ran through the streets, laughing like children, drenched from head to toe. Emily's wet hair clung to her face as she tried to catch her breath. She hadn't felt this free in years. And then, suddenly, he was right there. So close she could feel his warmth despite the cold. His gaze was intense, unwavering. "Emily," he whispered. She knew what was about to happen, and for the first time in years, she didn't run. She didn't stop him when he leaned in. She didn't stop herself when she tilted her face up. And when their lips met, soft, hesitant, yet filled with every emotion they had buried for so long. The world disappeared. The rain, the city, the years of pain. For that moment, it was just them. And the next morning, Emily woke up with her heart in absolute chaos. The kiss had been real. The emotions had been real. But what did it mean? Before she could figure it out, her phone rang. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Miss Carter," a deep voice said. "This is Margaret Sinclair. We need to talk." Emily froze. Alexander's mother. The woman who had always believed she was beneath their family. The woman who had once ruined her mother's life. And now, she wanted to talk. Emily's heart pounded, because deep down she knew this wasn't just a conversation. This was a warning. Emily's fingers gripped the phone tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Miss Carter," Margaret Sinclair's voice was cool, sharp, and utterly controlled. "We need to talk. In person." Emily's stomach twisted. Alexander's mother had never approved of her, not when she was just the maid's daughter, not now after the scandalous proposal that had set the world on fire. "There's nothing to talk about," Emily said, forcing steel into her voice. "Oh, but there is," Margaret replied smoothly. "I'd hate for this to turn into something regrettable. Meet me at the Rosewood Hotel. Noon." Click. The call ended, leaving Emily staring at the screen, her breath shallow. This wasn't an invitation, it was a command, a warning, a battle cry. And Emily knew one thing: Margaret Sinclair didn't lose. Though by the time Emily arrived at the luxurious 5-star hotel, she had convinced herself she wasn't nervous. But the moment she stepped inside the grand restaurant, her confidence wavered. Margaret Sinclair sat at a private table, her posture perfect, a delicate cup of tea resting in her manicured hands. She exuded wealth, elegance, and quiet power, the kind that could ruin a person with just a whisper. Emily forced herself forward. She wouldn't let this woman intimidate her. "Miss Carter," Margaret greeted, looking her up and down with a barely concealed smirk. "You look surprisingly composed, given the media circus you've found yourself in." Emily sat down, meeting the older woman's gaze. "What do you want?" Margaret's smile didn't falter. "You already know the answer to that." She leaned forward slightly. "Walk away from my son." Emily's breath caught, but she didn't look away. "And if I don't?" she challenged. Margaret sighed, as if speaking to a naive child. "Do you think this is a fairy tale, Miss Carter?" she asked. "Do you truly believe that a woman like you, someone with no wealth, no status, and a scandal attached to her name, can fit into our world?" Emily's hands curled into fists beneath the table. "I don't want to fit into your world." Margaret's expression darkened. "Then why haven't you rejected him completely?" she countered. Emily faltered. "Because she couldn't. Because despite the past, despite the pain, her heart was still drawn to Alexander." Margaret studied her reaction carefully. Then she delivered the final blow. "You think Alexander is different, don't you?" Her voice was soft now, almost pitying. "That he'll leave behind his fortune, his empire, just to live a simple life with you." She shook her head. "Men like my son don't change, Miss Carter. They only pretend to, until they get bored." Emily felt her chest tighten. Was that true? Would Alexander eventually leave? Margaret leaned back. "End this before he does. Save yourself the humiliation." Then, with a final cold smile, she rose, placed a large black envelope on the table and walked away. Emily stared at it. Slowly she reached forward, hesitating before flipping it open. Inside was a check, with her name on it, for $10 million. A lump formed in her throat. This was Margaret's final message. "This is your worth. Take the money and disappear." Emily's fingers trembled, and for the first time, she wasn't sure what to do. Meanwhile, Alexander was experiencing something entirely new. Life without privilege, and to his utter frustration, he was failing miserably. His first attempt at grocery shopping? A disaster. He had no idea what brands to buy, confused by the ridiculous variety of options. Laundry. A tragedy. He accidentally mixed colours and turned his white shirts pink. Public transportation. A nightmare. He missed 2 stops and had to walk back in the rain. By the time he reached Emily's flower shop, he was soaking wet, exhausted, and very aware that he was not made for this life. Emily blinked when she saw him. "What happened to you?" Alexander sighed dramatically, running a hand through his damp hair. "I am not meant for the subway." Emily bit back a laugh. "Let me guess. You got lost?" He crossed his arms. "I took a slightly extended route." She rolled her eyes. "Come on, let's get you dried off." As she handed him a towel, something shifted between them. Despite his obvious discomfort, despite his clear struggle to adapt, Alexander hadn't given up, and Emily couldn't ignore the warmth that spread through her chest at the thought. That evening, after closing the flower shop, Emily and Alexander found themselves sitting together under the city lights, sharing a cheap cup of coffee. It was a simple moment, no luxury, no expectations, just them. Emily exhaled softly. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander frowned. "Regret what?" "Walking away from the life you knew." He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "The only thing I regret is not fighting for you sooner." Emily's breath caught. For so long she had told herself that he hadn't changed, that he would never choose her over his world. But here he was, living in a tiny apartment, riding the subway, learning how to survive without his billions. And all for her. Could it be possible? Could he really be the same boy she once loved? Only now, a man willing to fight for her? The question haunted her as she rested her head against the back of the bench, staring at the stars. Alexander turned to her, watching her in silence. Then, in a voice so soft she almost missed it, he whispered, "I love you, Emily." Her heart stopped. Her lips parted, but no words came out, because in that moment she realized something terrifying. She loved him too, but love wasn't enough. Not when his mother was determined to destroy her, not when the world was watching their every move, not when Margaret Sinclair's warning still echoed in her mind. "Men like my son don't change. They only pretend to, until they get bored." Emily squeezed her eyes shut. She had 1 month to decide if she could trust him again. But what if she was making the biggest mistake of her life? Emily couldn't sleep that night. Alexander's words played over and over in her mind. "I love you, Emily." 3 simple words, yet they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the boy she had once loved had truly become a man who would fight for her. But then there was his mother's warning. "Men like my son don't change. They only pretend to, until they get bored." Emily tossed and turned in bed, staring at the ceiling. Was she setting herself up for heartbreak all over again? Her eyes flickered to the check still sitting on her nightstand. $10 million. Enough to change her life forever. Enough to walk away from Alexander and never look back. Her heart twisted. She didn't want the money. She wanted him. But could she ever truly have him? The next morning, Emily stepped out of her apartment and froze. Paparazzi. Everywhere. Dozens of reporters swarmed the street, cameras flashing, voices shouting. "Emily Carter, do you really love Alexander Sinclair, or is this just about money? Did you reject his proposal for publicity? Sources say Margaret Sinclair has offered you a payout. Did you accept it?" Emily's stomach churned. She had spent her entire life avoiding the spotlight. Now she was trapped in it. And the worst part? Someone had leaked the news about the $10 million check. It was all over the internet. Breaking. Emily Carter, allegedly offered $10 million to leave Alexander Sinclair. Will she take the money and run? Her hands trembled. There was only one person who could have leaked that information. Margaret Sinclair. Emily gritted her teeth. This was a trap. If she rejected the money, people would call her a liar, someone pretending to be selfless just to play the victim. If she accepted it, she would become exactly what everyone already believed, a gold digger who was never worthy of Alexander. Either way, she lost. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. She turned on her heel and ran. There was only one person who could fix this. Emily stormed into Alexander's office, past his security, past his assistant, and straight into his private suite. He was standing by the window, phone in hand, looking tense, until he saw her. "Emily." "Did you know?" She interrupted, her voice trembling. He froze. "Did you know your mother offered me $10 million to walk away?" A flicker of pain crossed his face, and in that instant, Emily had her answer. He had known. Her chest tightened. "You knew and you didn't tell me?" Her voice cracked. Alexander exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I was going to handle it." "Handle it?" she cried. "The whole world knows, Alexander. The media is ripping me apart and you were just going to handle it." His jaw clenched. "I didn't think she would go this far." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Then you don't know your mother at all." Silence filled the room. Alexander stepped forward, reaching for her. "Emily, please, don't let this ruin us." She took a step back. United States. Was there even an us? Because right now she felt more alone than ever. Emily swallowed past the lump in her throat. "Tell me the truth, Alexander," she whispered. He frowned. "What truth? Did you propose to me because you love me, or because you feel guilty?" Alexander's eyes widened. "Emily, you know I love you." "Do I?" she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, stepping away from him. "You say you love me, but you never told me about your mother's offer. You say you love me, but you let me walk into this scandal alone." Tears filled her eyes. "You say you love me, but if you had to choose between me and your world, would you still choose me?" Alexander's lips parted, but no words came out. And that silence shattered her. Because deep down, she already knew the answer. Her heart cracked into a million pieces. "I can't do this, Alexander," she whispered. "I can't be your charity case. I can't be your scandal. And I can't spend my life wondering if I'll ever truly belong in your world." Alexander reached for her again, desperate, but she stepped back. Her voice broke. "I can't be with someone who doesn't fight for me." Then, before he could stop her, she walked away. And this time, she didn't look back. Alexander stood there, staring at the empty space where Emily had been just moments ago. His chest ached. His world, his entire world, had just walked out the door. He had thought that his love alone would be enough. He had thought that 1 month would be enough. But he had been wrong. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Sinclair didn't know how to fix it. The love of his life was gone, and this time he might have lost her forever. Alexander Sinclair had everything, power, wealth, and an empire built on his father's legacy. But for the first time in his life, he felt empty. Days had passed since Emily walked out of his office, since she had looked at him with heartbreak in her eyes and told him she couldn't be with someone who wouldn't fight for her. And the painful truth. She was right. He had let her walk away before, but this time he wouldn't make the same mistake. Alexander sat in his penthouse staring at his phone. The media storm hadn't died down. If anything, it had only grown worse. And he had done nothing to stop it. His mother had done this. Margaret Sinclair had manipulated everything, leaked the story, twisted the truth, and nearly destroyed the woman he loved. And he had stood by, watching it unfold, instead of fighting for her. No more. Alexander grabbed his phone and called his assistant. Set up a press conference. Sir? I need the whole world to hear me. The next morning, every major news station broadcasted a live press conference from Alexander Sinclair himself. The world was watching. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and then the billionaire, usually cold, controlled, unreadable, stepped up to the podium. His face was raw with emotion. His stormy blue eyes, normally guarded, were filled with regret. And when he spoke, his voice trembled. I owe the world an explanation. The room fell silent. But more importantly, I owe Emily Carter an apology. Miles away in her small apartment, Emily froze. The live broadcast played on her tiny TV, and her heart pounded as she watched Alexander standing there, his heart exposed for the entire world to see. I made a mistake, he continued. I let my fear, my past, and my family come between us. And in doing so, I hurt the one person who matters most to me. Emily felt her throat tighten. My mother tried to pay Emily off. She tried to erase her from my life the way she erased so many things before. But Emily Carter is not someone who can be bought. Gasps rippled through the room. Margaret Sinclair's name was untouchable, but Alexander had just exposed her. Emily is the strongest, kindest, most beautiful person I have ever known. She doesn't need my money. She doesn't need my name. She doesn't need anything from me. He swallowed hard. But I need her. Emily's heart stopped. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes as Alexander took a deep breath. I love you, Emily. And if you're watching this, if you still believe in us, meet me at the place where it all began. The screen went black, and Emily could barely breathe. Emily sat there motionless. Her phone exploded with calls, texts. Emily! Did you see what he just did? Lena, he just ruined his reputation for you. Her co-worker, are you going to meet him? Unknown number. Her hands trembled. She had spent years believing that Alexander Sinclair would never fight for her. But now? He had just risked everything, his empire, his name, his relationship with his mother, all for her. She had to go. Emily's heart pounded as she arrived at the old Sinclair estate, the place where they had first met as children. The garden was exactly as she remembered it, overgrown with vines, yet still beautiful beneath the golden glow of the sunset. And then she saw him. Alexander stood in the middle of the garden, waiting. The moment their eyes met, he smiled. Emily's breath caught. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. She took a shaky step forward, then another, and then she was running, straight into his arms. He caught her, pulling her against him as if letting go would break him. I'm sorry, he whispered into her hair. I should have fought for you sooner. Emily's tears spilled over. You did. Her voice cracked. You did. Alexander? He pulled back just enough to cup her face, his hands trembling. Say it again, he murmured. Say you forgive me. She smiled through her tears. I forgive you. A breath of relief escaped him. And do you still love me? Emily's heart swelled. There had never been a choice. I never stopped. And then he kissed her. A kiss that was years in the making. A kiss that spoke of pain, longing, and an unbreakable love that had survived against all odds. The world faded. The past didn't matter, because in that moment they had found their way back to each other. 1 week later, Alexander proposed again, this time in private with only love between them. The media, the scandals, the world, they didn't matter anymore, because love had won. And this time, when Alexander asked her to be his wife, Emily Carter said yes. Emily Carter had spent years believing that love wasn't meant for people like her. She had convinced herself that fairy tales didn't exist. But now, standing on the balcony of Alexander Sinclair's penthouse, wrapped in his arms as the city lights twinkled below, she realized something. Some love stories weren't fairy tales. Some were real. Some were messy, complicated, and painful. But those were the ones that lasted. And hers and Alexander's. It was the kind of love that had been written in the stars. 1 week after the press conference, after all the scandals had settled, Alexander did it right. No cameras, no media, no pressure. Just them. They stood in the same garden where they had shared their childhood, the place where their story had first begun. Emily's heart pounded as Alexander took her hands in his fingers warm and steady. "Emily Carter," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I have loved you since we were kids. I have loved you through every mistake, every moment of regret, every second of distance between us." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't want a life without you. Not as a billionaire, not as a Sinclair. Just as a man who is hopelessly, endlessly in love with you." Then he dropped to one knee. And Emily gasped, her heart stopping. "Marry me, Emily. Not because of who I am, not because of my name, but because you love me too." Her lips trembled. "Alexander." She didn't hesitate this time. She didn't run. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times. Yes." The relief in Alexander's eyes was instant, pure, raw, and overwhelming, and when he slid the ring onto her finger. A simple yet elegant diamond, nothing too extravagant, just perfect. Emily knew that she had finally found her forever. The world faded. The past didn't matter, because love had won. The wedding that broke the internet. The world had been waiting. After the most shocking proposal in history, after the media scandals, the rejections, and the second chance at love, everyone wanted to know, would Emily Carter and Alexander Sinclair actually make it to the altar? And when the day finally arrived, the world stopped. Breaking, the wedding of the century, Alexander Sinclair and Emily Carter. Say I do. From poor florist to billionaire's bride, Emily Carter's fairy tale ending. The Sinclair estate was transformed into a breathtaking paradise. White roses, golden chandeliers, candle-lit pathways. But none of it mattered to Emily, because the only thing she cared about was him. A groom who couldn't take his eyes off his bride. Alexander Sinclair had always been a man of control, a man who never showed weakness. But as he stood at the altar, watching Emily walk toward him in a stunning white dress that made her look like a dream, he felt something he had never felt before. Tears. He blinked rapidly, but one escaped anyway. Because this wasn't just a wedding. This was everything. This was the moment he had waited for his entire life. When Emily reached him, she smiled softly, lifting a hand to wipe the tear from his cheek. "I never thought I'd see the day Alexander Sinclair cried," she teased, her voice shaking with emotion. He chuckled, taking her hands in his. "You changed me, Emily." Her lips trembled. "And you saved me, Alexander." Vows that melted the world. The officiant spoke, but neither of them really heard anything because all they could see was each other. Then, it was time. Alexander cleared his throat, his hands squeezing hers. "I promise to love you in every way possible, in wealth, in simplicity, in every storm and every sunshine. I promise to never let fear stop me from fighting for you, to never let my past define our future, and to love you with everything I am, for the rest of my life." Emily let out a soft, shaky laugh. "How am I supposed to follow that?" The guests chuckled, but when she looked into his eyes, her own vows came effortlessly. "I promise to love you for the man you are, not the billionaire, not the Sinclair, just the man who holds my heart. I promise to never run from us again, and I promise that no matter what happens, I will always, always choose you." Alexander let out a slow breath, as if she had just given him the very air he needed to breathe. "You may now kiss the bride." And Alexander didn't hesitate. He swept Emily into his arms, crushing his lips against hers, sealing a promise that had been written long before this moment. The world cheered. But all they heard was each other. The happily ever after, or the beginning of forever. After the wedding, Emily and Alexander didn't disappear into luxury. They chose a simple honeymoon. A little cottage in Italy, surrounded by rolling vineyards and golden sunsets. They spent their nights talking under the stars, making up for lost time. They spent their days laughing, loving, and building a future that was truly theirs. And when they returned, Alexander Sinclair announces he's stepping down as CEO. "My life belongs to more than just business." Emily was shocked. "You're leaving Sinclair Enterprises?" she asked, wide-eyed. Alexander smiled, pulling her close. "I built my father's empire," he said softly. "Now I want to build my own. With you." Her heart swelled. "And what does that future look like?" He kissed the tip of her nose. "Something simple, something real. A family. A life filled with love, not business meetings." Emily's breath hitched. "A family?" she whispered. Alexander smirked. "Are you ready for that?" Her lips curled into a smile. "With you? Always." Final scene. A love that inspired the world. A billionaire who gave up his fortune for love, Alexander and Emily's story captivates millions. The world had doubted them. Society had judged them. But love had won. And as Emily lay in bed one night, her fingers tracing over Alexander's, she whispered something she had never dared to say before. "I never believed in fairy tales." Alexander kissed her forehead, his voice warm against her skin. "Good thing our story isn't a fairy tale then," she smiled. "No, it's real. And that